Well, hello and welcome to the Creating Connections podcast, where I bring voices and perspectives from people who are making a difference for children's learning and development. I'm Rachel Stewart, and I'm passionate about connecting with people to share experiences and learn from each other how we can best support children to thrive. In this series of the podcast, we're exploring successful leaders in education so you can learn from a diverse range of people what makes a successful leader and how you can take their learnings and apply them to your leadership. Today, I'm introducing you to Amie Fabry. Amie is a passionate early childhood educator, researcher, and facilitator who is committed to empowering early childhood leaders to transform pedagogical practice. Amie uses a strengths-based approach to build the confidence, knowledge, and skills of early childhood educators, teachers, and leaders to create responsive and trusting cultures in which educators and children can thrive. She works at The Learning Future, and she draws on her multifaceted experiences working as an early childhood teacher, academic, policy consultant, and researcher to design and facilitate professional learning programs and projects that inspire and ignite transformation in the education of children. Amie's PhD research revealed the critical role early childhood leaders play in school settings, generating cultures of collaboration and connection that enhance children's transition into and through the early years of school. So I would like you to welcome Amie Fabry to the podcast today. Well, I'd like to officially welcome you to the podcast, Creating Connections podcast. You and I guess, connected not so long ago because we both share a passion for education and specifically early education and learning through play and all those wonderful things that children need to be doing to enhance their learning. And so I was really excited to speak with you about your work so that we can share what you're doing in schools and also early childhood space. So perhaps you can start by sharing how you entered early childhood and what your passion is and where it all started.
Yeah, wonderful. Thanks, Rachel. So lovely to be here and chatting to you again. I was thinking about this morning, actually. I got into early childhood. I think there's nothing I can completely pinpoint, but I just remember growing up and going through school myself and just knowing that I wanted to be an early childhood teacher. And I think it comes from my preschool teacher and my experience as a preschool student. I just fell in love with my preschool teacher. She was just everything you would want in a teacher. She was beautiful and kind and gentle and fun. And I loved going to preschool. And, back in the day when I went to preschool, it wasn't compulsory and it was, only a couple of days a week. But I just remember looking forward to it and always wanting to be there. And I think because she made me feel seen, like I knew I mattered to her. And that always stuck with me. Like she was one of the few teachers I remember. And I just admired her so much. So I think from a very young age, I was like, I want to be like her one day. And that kind of feeling never went away. So as I got older and I, really started to think about what I wanted to do, I just felt drawn to teaching. And I guess even then having teachers that I didn't like so much for various reasons, which we won't go into, I just remember thinking that actually teachers are so important and they have such a big impact on students. You can feel really comfortable completely yourself and at home in a classroom, or you could feel very uncomfortable. And that makes a huge difference to, like it did to me as a child, as to how I could engage with learning, even feel confident in myself as a learner. So I think it just was something I was always thinking about. And I just love young children. Like they're just so fun. They have so much curiosity and, zest for life. And it was just something I always knew I wanted to do. And then as soon as I started studying, I just fell in love with it even more. And I remember going on prac and it was just like, this is amazing. I can't believe this is actually a job because this is just going to be so joyful for the rest of my life. So that's kind of how I got into it. And, I was really fortunate in my first few jobs. Like I just adored it. And I had some incredible principals that I worked under. And, one in particular, when I first got my job, was just so supportive. So I just knew it was a calling for me, and then seeing, the response and the reactions and the interactions you have with those little people every day. Teaching is hard. but it was just so rewarding, just to be able to listen to someone and make them feel seen, just as my teacher had done for me, to really help our little people to connect with learning and get excited about learning. I was really passionate about that, and was definitely what centered around my practice was these little people and who they were and what they brought every day to the classroom and how I could help them to feel comfortable, but also help them to thrive, because, we do want them to be learning. It's not just about making them feel good. We want to see that progression as well, and finding ways to do that. That was really meaningful for them. So that's kind of how I got into early childhood. Really passionate about it, but I haven't been in the classroom for a little while now and ended up going on a few different paths.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, just while you were talking, then I just kept thinking back to when my three children were at kindergarten and in early childhood, and they had different teachers. But I recall some of the most amazing teachers were the ones who really were in tune with the kids. And like you said, just kids really need to have that connection and to feel safe, especially at that age. They really need that security and that sense of security. And you kind of almost become like another mum, don't you? And same with
Yeah.
primary school teachers, because they're so reliant on us for their safety and guidance. And one of the teachers that struck me was the way that she did connect with what the children were talking about. And they say the funniest things, don't they? And they're just so curious and have that spark. And she used to set up all the different stations every day to match their conversations. Like, she'd hear them talking about different things, and then the next day
Yeah.
they'd have like a fire station set up because one of them was talking about
Yep.
their dad being a firefighter or something. And just that connection was so profound. Like, and you could tell she just loved her job and was so
Yeah.
passionate about making sure the kids had good learning experiences. So can you share a little bit about the program that you've designed with your new job, in transitioning, I suppose, children into primary school?
Yeah, absolutely. So to give you a bit more context first before I jump into that, I have worked in a few different roles, and I've recently completed my PhD, and I was researching early childhood leadership in school settings. And what sort of led me to do that was that I had experienced from myself as a teacher, but then through different roles that I had since leaving the classroom. I've worked as an academic. I've been a prac supervisor, going out and mentoring prac students who are doing their undergrad teaching degrees. I've worked as a policy consultant for the education department, again going out to schools, actually seeing what practice is happening and talking to teachers and hearing about what was supporting them, but also challenging them. And I could see that there was what I suspected was a missing link. And in schools, I believe that we need to have early childhood leaders who are actually present in the school in how they can influence and support our teachers. And so a lot of the work that I had done at the education department, and now fortunate to be doing again at the Learning Future, is to actually support our educators, but also to support our educators to become leaders, so that in a school system, they are actually able to support their colleagues. And they don't have to have all the answers, because, teaching is hard. And when we're talking about things like play-based learning, it's really complex. And meeting the needs and responding to the needs and interests of every child, can be really challenging to do. But educators need time and space to actually have those really deep conversations and reflections, and they need to feel supported to do that. So part of the work that I do is to help them through professional development on their own. But what I'm really passionate about is helping them to become strong, capable, confident leaders in a school setting where not everybody understands early childhood. You've got primary colleagues, and you've often got principals and deputies or associate principals who don't often have any early childhood experience or knowledge. So it's really important that we have strong early childhood educators and leaders to be a voice for our younger children, to advocate for age-appropriate practice like play-based learning, but also to support the educators on that journey, so that they feel really empowered and equipped to include play and be responsive to all of those little people and make them all feel safe, while they're still kind of, helping them to learn, I guess, academically and meet some of our system expectations that are there, and they're probably not going away. So we've also got to work in the parameters of what school is.
Yeah, and I think that's probably the biggest challenge, isn't it? Because that transition is quite a big leap for a lot of kids. And all of a sudden they don't have, I suppose, as much freedom to like move around the room and just try different things and be like using experimental learning. And there is, even though there is structure in the early childhood space, it's still quite a lot more structured once they transition into primary. And I suppose what is your motivator or drive to actually do that? Is it because you have seen, and I've seen this myself, that children tend to lose a bit of their spark when they get to when they go into primary school and they start to be a bit too structured and they forget how to play and how to be creative, and if it's not happening at home, then obviously that impacts them as well. Would that be your motivation or your drive for this work?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, if I think about everything I've learnt, in my time studying to become an early childhood teacher and then through different roles and being a teacher myself, of course, is, I think the greatest thing we can do as educators is actually enable every single child to have a strong sense of who they are as an individual and how they contribute to the world around them. And that often starts within their family, and it's within their community, or it's within their classroom. So I think we do, and I have seen other children, and I'm certainly not saying I was a perfect teacher, but I think I have seen examples where children, you can see, are not able to be themselves. I've been that child. So I know how important that is, and that's really what drives that for me. And I am so passionate about play-based learning because it enables children to be themselves and find their unique ways of expressing themselves, of really keeping that curiosity and spark, and we know every child is born curious, but we also know we have systems in place, and sometimes we make lots of decisions for children, and I don't think we do it consciously, but I think unconsciously we say to them, well, no, I've got a better way, or we say to them, no, do it my way. Everyone do the same. So I think children do lose their spark, their boldness and their confidence, and as a parent, I've seen that in my own children. They come out into the world full of ideas and they want to tell you everything because they know best. And then, suddenly they do get to school, and things become quite different when it gets really structured. And it does happen sort of past the early years. I think it depends on the school, and it depends on their philosophy, and it depends on the teachers. Absolutely. And I live in Western Australia, where we've actually got kindergarten, which is the 4-year-old non-compulsory program, and pre-primary, which is our first year of school. They're in the same school. So we have kindergartens in schools, and we see huge transitions from kindergarten to pre-primary. Then we often see another one from pre-primary to year one, where sometimes it's seen as, right now we've got to get onto the serious, business of learning and all the work. And for many teachers, it's a struggle to sort of, how do we keep that play, or it's not something that they're used to. So it is really hard for a child, and I know when I was teaching pre-primary and kindergarten, I'd get to students that would go up through the primary school, and they'd come back and pop in and they'd go, oh gosh, I wish I could come back to kindy, or I wish I could come back to pre-primary, because it was fun, and I think it is about, how do we actually help our youngest people to thrive? I believe it is through being responsive, giving them opportunities to be themselves and to learn in ways and express themselves in unique ways, because we're not all the same. We are just not all the same, and we're not the same as adults. When you look at your colleagues and you look at your family members and you look at your friends, we don't do the same things. We don't act in the same way. We don't necessarily show what we know, or we don't come to understand things in depth in the same way. So I think, we need to be honoring that right from the beginning all the way through. So yes, I think that's absolutely what drives it. It's all about children.
Yes.
How do we really support them and nurture them to thrive and not just learn?
Yeah, and a lot of it's about understanding how they learn too, isn't it? And I know that I guess in the work I've been doing, I am surprised that there's a lot of things that we still don't know about how we learn. And I've done a lot of research for parents to help them understand, and wrote it in my book to help them understand how children learn. Because if we understand how they learn, we don't get as frustrated with them, and we can actually work with them. And just recently, as you were talking just then too, it reminded me of an interview I did with some children in primary school recently, and I asked them what their favorite subjects were. And most of them said music, drama, and art. And I asked them why. Why is that your favorite subject? And this beautiful little boy, he was almost in tears. He was just so emotional, talking about how he knew that he could express himself through art. And in art class, he could actually share how he was feeling through his art. And it is that deep soul connection, isn't it, really, for kids to be able to access their creativity, but also to express themselves. Just a question, it could be controversial. Why do you think there is a resistance to really exploring the arts, play, creativity, music, and investing more in that side of learning than, the more academic side of maths and literacy, which is all connected anyway? But why is there such a resistance in Australia, particularly around the creative arts as being really emphasised as part of learning?
That's a great question. I think it's complex and there's not a simple answer, but I think it stems from our system. And we assess literacy and numeracy predominantly, and we assess academics. So we don't assess creativity. You might get a comment on a report, but it's not really an assessment in the same way. So we don't put the weight behind it. We don't actually value it as much as we do literacy and numeracy and even sciences and HASS. So therefore, teachers and schools feel pressure to get children performing academically. And because of that pressure, that's where the time goes. That's where the money goes. And, that's where the professional development goes. So, I know schools will spend thousands and thousands of dollars on literacy programs because that's what's being measured and that's what they're being judged against. But then, there isn't the budget to support play-based learning or to send teachers on professional development to understand play-based learning. So I think that's a big problem. But I also will be the first to say that we have systems in place, but they are also they're not binding. And I think we have to meet those system requirements. But when you look at one school that's completely play and inquiry based and another school that's perhaps very explicit, that tells you that it's actually possible. So I think we can work within those parameters. It's difficult. It's actually really challenging. Like, it's much easier to, for educators and even for principals and school leaders to put in a program that says, well, here's what you have to go through. It's all mapped out for you. Everyone's doing the same thing. It's easier to manage. It's easier to do the marking. If you're thinking in contrast to a play-based approach where you might have 8 or 10 different play-based learning experiences in a classroom, and you've got children doing all different things, that's so much more complex for that educator to be across the curriculum and what could be coming out of each of those play experiences. There might be some really intentional learning outcomes in there, but essentially you might have 20 to 30 children all doing something different, much harder to be across them. And then there's questions about how do we plan for that? How do we capture their learning? How do we actually be observing and listening and engaging with them so we know what's coming out of those play experiences in terms of outcomes? So it is really complex, I think, at every level. It's difficult for educators. It's hard because of the system and what the system wants to see in terms of outcomes. But I also think there's a lot of misunderstandings about play and a lot of misconceptions around play and inquiry. And they're often, talked about in terms of being the opposite of good teaching or the opposite of explicit instruction, which we know is important and has a time and place, but they're not the opposite. Play is actually a context for learning. But I think that's a misconception. So, a lot of the conversations I hear and things I read in the media or on the conversation or in articles are, well, if we're direct instruction or explicit instruction is just presented as being the opposite of play or inquiry, with a misconception that play and inquiry is completely child-led and the educator does nothing. And I think that's partly why there's some resistance, because, there are some really strong arguments that are happening in our education community against play for that reason, that it's sort of become construed and presented as not being learning if children are just doing everything on their own and they're left to their own devices to hopefully learn on their own, which is just not the case. So that's really unhelpful. And I think that then puts educators and principals, unfortunately, in a position where they feel like they have to choose. Are we actually about, what we know from evidence, or here's the teaching we should be doing and here's the outcomes that we're seeing, and perhaps we've seen other schools go down this path and so they're getting good outcomes, well, we better do the same. Or if it's pitted against play-based learning, inquiry learning, then, well, am I going to choose that path? And if you don't know, I think that's where people get stuck, and I think that's where some of that resistance is coming from.
Yeah, it is challenging for educators, but there's also a lot of long-term benefits and benefits for children's other learning, the explicit learning, by engaging in play, because the cognitive and non-cognitive skills that they're learning, especially if they are self-led, is profound. And I feel that there's not enough education of educators around those benefits in a lot of ways. I'm not an expert in knowing what every school is doing, but it seems that the actual benefits for the brain is what matters with play, more specifically than, I suppose, explicit outcomes of the play. But I have seen it in action, and it is amazing when it is actually done properly. And I suppose you can share some examples of that yourself, where you've seen some schools really do it well and the teachers are on board. And that's what it takes, doesn't it? It has to be a whole school approach, and all the teachers need to be on board and really understanding the purpose for play and what those benefits are. So maybe you could share some examples of some schools that you've seen do it really well.
Yeah, look, I'm in Western Australia, and, across, we've got three sectors, like, all states. We've got our independents, our Catholics, and we've got our department schools. But across the board, they all face similar challenges. And we've got some amazing schools that, are completely project orientated, and children have so much agency. And I think that's really at the heart of play for me, is, again, coming back to that, developing the whole child. And what you're talking about in terms of brain development and outcomes, the beauty of play is that it is not just about learning maths or literacy, but actually, while you are engaging with a concept, you're not just skimming over the top and learning this is something because someone's told me. Like, if we think about, mass and weight and heaviness as a concept, a child isn't going to understand that this one's heavier than that by looking at a picture of something. They actually need to physically get in the sandpit and fill up a big bucket and try and lift it and go, oh, this is heavy. That's how they really build depth of understanding, and understanding, not just knowledge content. So play is fundamental for that reason. But then while a child is playing, they're socializing. And they're learning from other people. So they might be watching what somebody else does, or they're working together to solve a problem and someone shares a new idea. So they're learning while they're engaged in a social situation. They're learning from each other. They're learning to communicate and problem solve. They're learning language and using language, and oral language is so fundamental for literacy. So that's another bonus, plus, again, if you're in a play situation where you can contribute and you've got people around you and peers or an educator who are accepting of your ideas, that's also building your self-identity. Not to mention the physical skills. As you're actually manipulating objects and materials, you're building hand dexterity and manipulation of your fingers, which is going to help you to actually read and write. And physically, you're developing your shoulder strength, your arm strength, your core strength. All of these things that we know are actually really fundamental for children to even sit at a desk or to attend and focus on something. So, self-regulation and executive function are fundamental, and that's developed through play. We also know that, children need all of those skills to actually be more effective learners as they progress through primary school into high school and beyond. And we're seeing in evidence that, children are playing a lot less than they used to across the country and across the world. We've had reductions in play in many countries because we've kind of gone, well, we need to spend more time on instruction. So, let's reduce recess and lunchtime. And then when you add in the fact that children are not playing so much in their home lives, if I reflect on my own childhood, I was never home. I was always out in the street playing or down the park or, building forts out of leaves and sailing them across the lake and, climbing trees and doing all of these things, whereas children don't play so much anymore. And there's so many reasons for that. So play is just fundamental. It is complex, but it is really fundamental. And I think, as you sort of said before, I don't think all of our educators understand that. And I think a lot of educators that I've spoken to, even if they've, done their early childhood qualified, they may have learnt all of these amazing things about play and they might feel really strongly about play, but then they go into a school system or a school setting, because they're all different, where play is not accepted, or play might only look like this tiny part of the day or tiny part of the curriculum. It's not really embedded as a way of learning. Sometimes play is used as a break from learning. So once you've got through all of the teacher tasks, then you can go and play.
Or it's used as a reward.
Yeah, or a way of managing all of these children. If I work with a small group, the rest can play. And because I know play is good, play, they're getting something out of the play. So a lot of teachers use play in different ways, and that sort of muddies the water a little bit. But I think it is because a lot of schools don't have the systems and support set up, as you were talking about. Where it works well, it's fundamental to that school's philosophy. And so they do have a really strong purpose about why. And I think in this day and age in particular, with the current climate around education and all the expectations, I think for any educator, you have to know your why, and you have to know why we're doing this, because if you don't know why, it's really easy to be pushed in a whole heap of directions. And in fact, teachers are pulled in different directions, and that's partly why they feel really overwhelmed at the moment, because there's too much to do and there's a lot of expectation on them. So having a really strong sense of why is fundamental. And the schools that I've seen that do this well, they have like a really beautifully articulated document or a philosophy that actually says, here is what we value and here's what we believe in for children. And they use that over and over again to keep planning, to keep reflecting on their practice. And there will be times where they feel that they've shifted away from that, but that becomes a really anchoring piece that brings them back together and helps them to find their way back to what they really value, and to keep advocating and fighting for that and holding on to it. And it's about supporting all of the educators on that journey, because it is really challenging.
It is. And so it just leads me to sort of think, what are the areas that you need to focus on with teaching staff? Would one of those be, you mentioned, designing the lessons around concepts. And of course, not everyone is taught how to create concepts. I have a background in graphic design, so I love coming up with concepts. Even still in my work now, I come up with concepts all the time and ideas, and love to be creative. But not everyone sees themselves as creative. And I think that in some of the seminars and things I've been to over the years, that topic sometimes comes up in conversation, where teachers need to sort of break out of that perception that they're not creative, that education can't be creative. But learning through play and science, even I interviewed a science leader recently, and she was talking about how difficult it was to get her staff to be more creative in how they delivered the lessons for the in secondary school in science, and making it fun, because science is fun. Do you think that that's an area that you're focused on in terms of support for teachers, to help them understand that, yes, you can actually be creative and really just go outside the box and really explore the possibilities for kids and make it more
Absolutely.
engaging.
Yeah, absolutely. It's so fundamental, as you said, like we are all creative and we forget that we're creative. And I think that's partly because of our school experience. Like younger children are really creative and expressive. And like if I think about even some of the work my children have done from a more a visual perspective, if we think about creativity, which everyone goes, I can't draw and I can't paint, which is obviously creativity is about problem solving and coming up with novel ideas, right? But if I think about even from that one lens, which is quite illustrative, a 2-year-old might be painting this beautiful abstract piece, or their representations are not necessarily what we would know exactly, or you've drawn a person or painted a person, but that's their depiction of it and they can talk you through that and they're so confident. And that becomes a really beautiful tool for language and sharing and expressing that we were talking about. But then as you see what they go through school, suddenly anything that's considered creative is, well, we've all coloured in this page, or we've all drawn this exact thing and we got talked through how to do it, or we've used the paper plate and we've all painted this chicken and we've stuck the eyes on, and everything's done for you. So actually we've misconstrued creativity, I think.
Yeah.
And a lot of educators that I talk to about this go, oh wow, that's right, creativity actually should be everyone looks different. And if it doesn't, it's not creativity, because it's not them actually expressing and representing their own ideas.
It's really a type of conditioning, isn't it? In a lot of ways, because if kids, I'm just thinking of an art class that I was photographing, and they were all doing the map of Australia, but they were doing it in the Indigenous style with the dot painting, but every person had the same map.
Yep.
And that, I guess that makes it easier for the teacher, but it's not really expressing their creativity. They could draw the map of Australia however they wanted to, if you were willing to let them do that.
Absolutely.
And really just dive into their intuition and really get into that space. And I think that in a lot of ways, structured art class is really not that creative in many ways, but that freedom to create is not necessarily there. Would you say?
Absolutely. And I think because it's not nurtured, it's like any skill. If you don't use it, you feel like you lose it. And so then you have to go and find it again, and I think that's why so many adults are not expressing themselves creatively. So they are creative as beings, but they're not being creative because of the conditions that they've either been through, but then even the environment they might work in, or how they engage in their personal life. So creativity is a tricky one, like it is something though that we really need. And as educators, if we want to engage in play-based approaches, or in afford children opportunities to be authentic, we need to be more creative in that space, because if we're going to see it as a rigid sort of lesson, here's the outcome, everyone's going to look like that, there's no space for children. But you also can't be creative as an educator in that space. So I know one of the things that we talk about, particularly even in our leadership program, is as a leader, how do you then encourage and support educators to be more creative? And being creative, of course, is not just about the visual pictures, which everyone thinks, but how do we actually become innovative? We need to create space, and that is time, but it's also the way that we show up and we engage with other people. It's about how we connect with each other, and how do we create a space of belonging and safety that every educator can say, I'm grappling with this. How can we unpack this? How can we move forward? How can you help me? And collectively, or even with one other person, to throw around some ideas, or could you try this, or could you try this? So there's a space for educators to actually be creative, but they need to feel safe to be creative, that it's okay to not have an answer or the answer. And I think sometimes in schools as well, we end up in these cultures where there's one way to do things, a right way or a wrong way. And I think that's really unhelpful, because there's multiple ways. Children are complex. We're all complex in the way that we show up and do our work. So there isn't one way. There isn't one way that fits everybody. And I think we need to step back from that But that can be really scary for a lot of educators, particularly if they've worked in schools where this is how we do it and there is one way to do it. Then we need to actually create that safe space for them to feel comfortable. And one way that leaders can do that is actually to model that practice, model the uncertainty, and then actually respond appropriately by saying, well, it's okay to not know. And that can feel really, really uncomfortable. But even though it feels uncomfortable, we have to sit in that space and we have to be prepared to say, I don't know. I don't know how this is going to go and I don't have all the answers, but I am a knowledgeable and experienced educator. I know curriculum, I know where we're headed, and I know these children. So let's go on this journey. And I think when you have that space for an educator to take that back to your classroom and do that, you need that permission to be yourself and to be creative. And I find that educators slowly start to almost come out of their shell and reacquaint themselves with their own creativity. But that's where all the passion and joy comes as an educator. That's the fun part of being an educator, is actually having the space and being creative and being, brave enough to say that I don't know how this is going to go, so I'm going to follow the children's lead, or I'm going to try something new today and see what happens. But that's really, really integral. And I think that's where our school leaders, but certainly having, early childhood leaders that support educators and walk alongside them on this journey is really helpful.
Yeah, I had an experience recently. I run learning through play workshops for parents, and some teachers actually joined in on the workshop.
Oh,
And it
amazing.
was such an interesting experience for them because they had to be creative, because I get them to play and talk with them about the impact of play on learning, and to help parents understand that they can be doing these things at home to encourage play and how much it impacts their cognitive and non-cognitive skills. And the teachers at the end were really fascinated with how they could use the play, get the children to play, but then use it as provocation for learning literacy. So instead of saying to them at the end of the school holidays, what did you do on your school holidays? Get them to create a piece that explained their holidays or whatever they did or whatever they want to create, then write about it. So bringing literacy into the play and really using it as a way to engage the students in, getting moving and interacting and all of those different skills that you talked about before. But yeah, it was interesting to hear their perspective and how important it would be to actually get teachers to play first, to see what they come up with and to see that they can be creative.
Absolutely. I was running a workshop the other day and we used Play-Doh actually with the educators because, when you, even as an adult, when someone says write something down or articulate this for me, like what is it that you think, feel, or do? Some of us go, oh, is there a right answer? What are they looking for? How do I get this right?
Yeah.
There's this sense of pressure to perform, and children are the same. So when you want to know what they, did on the weekend, I love that example because when it's straight to the writing, it's like, well, how do I write this? And how do I not make a mistake? And, how do I spell that word? And there's so much for them to remember just in trying to write that
Some
when you
children,
actually,
sorry
sorry.
sorry to interrupt. Some children may not have had a very good experience on the weekend.
That too.
And that's a way of the teacher identifying that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's again why play is so powerful. And it works beautifully for adults as well. We can actually get to what really matters, which, if you want to know what children did on the weekend, that's the important part of this story. Or if you want to talk to educators and find out what matters to them, you actually want to get people talking and get to what they really want to share, again, creating that safe space for them to express themselves. That's the goal. So play is a beautiful way to do that. I love that you're running workshops with families and with educators coming along. That's brilliant, Rachel.
Yeah. I wish there would be more. That sort of leads me to talk about parent engagement. And I know that in some schools who do introduce learning through play, there can be some pushback from parents, which is in some ways why they need to be educated around the benefits of play. how do you work with leaders to encourage them to engage parents in learning at home? Because it would seem to be that, or seem to me that everything that they're learning through play at school is so rich and rewarding. And to share that with parents would just be amazing. And for that to continue at home, especially the language they're using and the different ways that teachers are, I suppose, assessing their learning and really identifying what they are actually learning so that it sort of breaks down those misperceptions around play.
Yeah, absolutely. We know so much from research now that that strong, effective partnerships between schools or services and families is fundamental and makes a huge difference for every child in their own learning. And if we think about it, sort of happens on a continuum, obviously, if you think about relationships and a really close partnership with families, you would see similar practices and values being upheld at the school, but also at home, around play and some of the same language, or, there would be this shared understanding about some of the concepts that the children are learning and exploring so that they could be doing them at home and sharing it with their parents as well would be amazing. But on the other end, of course, you would have the divide where families and schools don't really get along or see eye to eye, or they're not working together. And I think it can be really easy to fall into the trap of blaming, that if families are not supportive of a program, well, that's their fault. Or if they're not, supporting the program by way of making sure their child is at school, or they have the materials they need, or whatever it might be, they're questioning you as an educator. It's, I think we can sometimes just go, well, they're being really difficult. Or, I have worked with schools that'll say, well, we can't do a play-based approach because the families don't want it. And I understand that, and I fully respect every family's wishes because they are their child's first teacher, and they are fundamental to every child. But we also need to work with our families. So it's always about building those connections and getting to know them, really getting to understand who they are, but also what they value. And again, it's really important, I think, for educators and schools to not only share and be really generous in sharing their knowledge and understanding, what they're seeing happening in the classroom, always sharing examples of, we did this great experience today. Here's some of the comments that came out of the children. Here are their questions. This is what they're wondering. The more we can share that learning process, and it is a process when it's play-based as opposed to an end piece of work, I think that's really important to tell the story over a long period of time, but also to make sure we're not just telling families, but we're also learning from families is really fundamental. So we're understanding, for some families, they just simply don't know what we know. And we need to be really empathetic to that and actually then go, well, how do we support that? Perhaps with a workshop like you're running is a wonderful way to actually say to families, well, would you like to learn more about this and how can we support you to do that? I think that's critical, but it's also about helping families to understand where their differences might be so that we can alleviate some of their fears. I think if you talk to any family or any parent, generally what they want most for their child is for them to be happy and to be comfortable at school, have friends, to be a good person, and nobody wants their child to not succeed academically. We all want our children to go through school with as little pain as possible in terms of struggle, but also to then, come out the other end with options, right? So I think we're all similar in that. But for many families, I think they do actually have some fears that are not necessarily being addressed, and they can't be addressed if you don't know what they are. So I always absolutely encourage educators and schools to, again, not only engage with families, but often think creatively about how you engage with families, because sometimes the ways we've done things before don't work. I've had teachers who will say, well, we run a workshop at the very beginning of the year or a parent information and they don't come, or we send stuff and they don't come. So we don't do it anymore. And I'm like, well, there's more. How about you find out why? So I think we have to be creative too. But, I fully respect that educators are busy and families are busy as well. Life is busy, more families and parents work, so there's less time. So we have to be cognizant of all of the actual practicalities that are going on. But I think ultimately, reciprocal communication and finding ways to invite families in to learn from them is a really good starting place.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that we can always make excuses as to why we're not doing things. And there's usually deeper reasons why. And there is that factor around relationships, which you've touched on today as well. And really exploring that relationship between home and school and how we can bridge the gap and try and help our educators to work more effectively with parents and understand parents, because we know, yeah, there's a lot of challenges around that particular relationship. But everything that we've talked about today is about relationship and connection. And one of the greatest things that creativity and play does is to help us connect with ourselves. And I think that now more than ever, that's really important to teach our kids, is to really connect deeply with themselves and know who they are as an individual, and to be proud of their creations and their individuality. So I think it's been a really interesting discussion today that we've had around all of those different topics. Is there anything else you'd like to share, especially how people can get in touch with you to explore your leadership training program?
Oh, absolutely. It was such a great conversation, Rachel. It's always lovely to talk to you. I
Likewise.
Yeah, and we could talk about this all day, I think,
We
because there's
could.
it is so complex and there's so many layers when you peel them back. But it is fundamentally all about relationships. I think educators need to have a good relationship with themselves, and that's connecting to their own purpose. But to think again about those relationships with colleagues and families, and of course, children. And the more curious I think we become about other people, we open up to actually learning and building really strong reciprocal conversations that are two-way. So it's fundamental. But you asked how people can get in touch with me. So I work at the Learning Future. They can reach out to me via email, which is just Amie, AMIE, at thelearningfuture.com. I'm on LinkedIn and Instagram if people want to hunt me down. I love to hear from educators. So if anyone's got a question about anything, I'd really, my virtual door is open. So feel free to drop by and say hello.
I'll pop some links below anyway, so people can get in touch with
Oh,
you.
wonderful.
And
That'd be
yeah,
great.
I look forward to hearing more about your work and your successes
Likewise.
in helping leadership. And it's been really amazing talking with you today, and I hope to be in touch soon.
Thanks, Rachel. Likewise. Look forward to following your journey too. Thank you for the conversation.
You're welcome. Enjoy the rest of your day.
You too.
Bye.
Bye.
Well, what another inspiring interview in our Leadership in Education series of our Creating Connections podcast. If you enjoyed this interview and would like to learn more from other leaders in education, please click on the subscribe button to receive further podcasts on your feed. If you'd like to be a guest on our podcast, click on the link below to book a meeting with me to learn more about you and your leadership in education. Or if you're listening to this podcast, send an email to rachel@practicallylearning.com.au to express your interest in being on the podcast. If you are a school leader or teacher with aspirations for leadership, but you're challenged with self-doubt, overwhelm, and whether you have what it takes to take that next step, our Connect with Your Mind Mastery Coaching Program can support you to work on your own self-mastery to become the leader you aspire to be. For further information about our coaching and professional learning programs, please visit our website at practicallylearning.com.au or click on one of the links below and visit our podcast for our future series of interviews to support you as the adults who are guiding children on their learning journey. I do hope you enjoy the rest of our episodes on our Creating Connections podcast, and I hope to meet you soon.